Thank you very much. Welcome again also to Prio. Can everyone hear me at the back? No, I think that's yes. Thank you. Sorry, Martin. I'm really happy that I have a chance here to speak to you, and that I will be able to do this based on about 20 years of research on issues related to refugees. So my task, I think, here is to put refugees back in the picture. And most of my work has been on the Horn of Africa, specifically Somalia. This, by the way, is from is our graphic illustrations from a book on Somalis in European cities, which show some of the experiences that people talked about. First of all, you're here at Prio, the Peace Research Institute Oslo. What we do is we conduct research on the conditions of peaceful relations between states, groups, and individuals. And we also look at the consequences, or the causes as well as the consequences of violent conflict. One of the things that we are then looking at is how violent conflict actually impacts individuals, societies, families, and especially also how people manage to cope with violent conflict. One of the ways in which people cope is actually through migration. And we've been doing research on this for almost 10 years now here at Prio. So I'll talk to you about that, and specifically from my background as an anthropologist. And I was thinking, since we have this distinguished panel of speakers with such different backgrounds and different positions, what is it that I offer? And I think very much as an anthropologist, what I'll try to do is bring the human dimension back in and also allow you to relate to people that seem quite different from us. And I think that's what I can do because I've been conducting interviews and life histories since 1995, mainly with Somali refugees. I've not done, and I have to say this and state this very clearly, I've not done research on what's happening in the Mediterranean. So it's mainly based on these life histories with Somali refugees, which I think still are very important also in understanding what is going on in the Mediterranean. And I'll explain that as well. But in those life histories with refugees, what comes up really, really clearly is how war and displacement actually plays such a central role in those lives. And I've had many horrific stories, but what I think is most remarkable is actually the human capacity to cope, to move on, and also to stay humane. I think that's what has been most amazing, actually, that people in refugee camps stay humane, and they do that mainly by helping others. And that's a way not just of surviving as a community, but it's also a way of maintaining dignity. So by assisting others who are in worse position, it's actually possible to maintain dignity. So I think my main task here is to bring agency back into the picture. I'll give you a number of quotes from these 2-3 hour interviews I've done with a lot of different people, and I'll explain a bit why those quotes were chosen. And I've tried not to focus on those horrific events that I talked about, because I don't think that's doing the discussion much good. So this is an interview I did quite recently with Ubah Aden for the Gensom project. And she talks about the period where they realized the conflict was starting in Mogadishu. And she says, I remember that I did the test, I passed, and I got a place in medicine in Somalia. And my uncle, who worked in the Somali National Bank, bought a really nice school bag. He bought books, everything was ready. But after some days, the war happened. So that was my story. I remember we ate breakfast, and my mom and my aunt asked, what shall we take with us? And he said, don't take a lot. Just take small things. We will certainly be back in a week or two. I remember that I thought I will not take my school bag. if I take it on the journey, it's definitely going to get spoiled. So I took the bag and I placed it in a very good cupboard. And I took with me some few clothes. I ate breakfast. We just took some small things. And of course, I spoke to her in November 2014 here in Oslo. She's lived in Norway for almost 20 years. She's never returned. She's actually quite scared. She wants to return now because there are increasing numbers of Somalis returning from Oslo to sea, to visit Mogadishu. But she's a little bit, she doesn't like taking risks, I can tell you. And she managed to come to Oslo from Nairobi by plane at that time. She also never managed to study medicine, but she's completed a master's. And she's actually the one person that insisted I use her real name. She's a local politician and she's contributing a lot to Oslo at the moment. Secondly, I called it early warning system. And this was an interview I did many years ago with Dahaba Ahmed in the Dadaab refugee camps of Kenya. And she worked at the time in 1988. She worked for Care International in Mogadishu. And she says, I first noticed sign of war in 1988 when I was pregnant with our firstborn. There were rumors that some roads had been blocked because army people were capturing one area after the other. The food aid at that time also decreased instead of increased. And I saw that the first agency workers were going. A few of them were leaving town already. That is when I suspected that the conditions were worsening. So that was a very good early warning system. The internationals were leaving Mogadishu. And then she explains afterwards how she tried to survive. And she says, from morning to evening, I was thinking about whether I would survive the afternoon or whether I would survive the night. And if I survived the night, I would still wonder whether I would survive the next day. I was worried because people were losing their lives so suddenly. I was too worried to sit, to eat, something to chew, because I feared that people might come and kill me. And I met her in 2002, I think, in Dadaab, where she had lived for many years. Thirdly, this was an interview I did in Nairobi with someone who has a very high position now in Somalia, in the government, whom I call Mohammed Shuki. And he explained how he didn't want to leave, but he had to. I was pressured by my family and friends to leave for many months, but I stayed until July 2008 when I realized I really had to go. 2 of my close friends and colleagues were assassinated, and I knew I was not safe. Both my friends were very active and engaged, and both of them were clearly deliberately targeted. He didn't want to leave because he played such an important role in what was happening, and I was really trying to address the injustices that he saw in Mogadishu, but he at some point really had to do this because he was next. And he stayed in Nairobi for a couple of years until he realized it was safe and then moved back again. So what do I want to say with this? I think I do want to say something about mobility and self-protection. So what happens when people are faced with violent conflict? How do they cope? Well, one of the ways in which they cope is by moving away from violent conflict. It's a central strategy for individuals to guarantee both their own survival as well as the survival of family members. And at times this is reactive and sudden. At times all of a sudden you have to pack up everything and leave. But very often the decision to migrate or not is something that individuals and families constantly reflect on. And they reflect on it constantly in a conflict situation, but also while they're somewhere else. Because it's this constant, okay, where am I safe? What information can I trust? What do I know? What will happen here in Mogadishu? What will happen if I move to Kismayo? And then, okay, maybe you take the risk, and then you're in Kismayo and you find war breaks out. Then where do you go? So it's this constant reflecting on how do I use migration to be safe and to have my family be safe. And now, obviously, I'm specifically talking about people who are caught up in armed conflict or specifically targeted, persecuted individually. In these migration decisions, people balance both security needs and also livelihood survival. Obviously, if you bring your family to somewhere where there's no violent conflict, but they have nothing to eat. Your children are going to die of starvation. That is also not an option. So they have to balance security needs with livelihood survival. And for those affected, then protection is both physical safety, but also basic needs. And those decisions are rarely based on individual protection concerns. They are decisions that are made on a family level. And this is because different family members face different risks, and they have also access to different strategies to protect themselves. And I'll show you some examples of that, where it's mainly parents who make decisions about where their children might be safe. This is from an interview done in Hargeisa, in a camp for internal displaced people. A lady also from Mogadishu who says, but the problem was that Al-Shabaab had their eyes on my son. He was only a teenager, he did nothing wrong, but they had accused him of being against Islam, and they wanted to take him to sentence him. I would not have been a good mother to my son if I had let Al-Shabaab take him. So she decided to move because there was a risk that the boy would be taken by Al-Shabaab. I also know of other stories where someone in Oslo, for example, says, okay, I sent money to my brother because I was afraid that he would actually join Al-Shabaab. So not be forced to join, but join because that was the best livelihood opportunity he had. So I got him out of there. I made sure that he's now in Ethiopia, and at least that is not a risk I have to face. And Uba also talked about what happened when they moved to Kenya. And she says, my mother and relatives had already reached the decision to send all the young women in the camp or in the family to Kenya right away, as there were reports of widespread rape in the city. So there was also this consideration that, okay, well, young women face particular challenges, particular risks that families wanted to protect them against. So how do I move now from the Horn to the Mediterranean? Why is all of this relevant? Why am I trying to put refugees back into the picture? When maybe, okay, we're talking about, I'm specifically doing research on Somali refugees, and they're a small number at the moment. But I think these stories illustrate that the need to flee conflict zones is often non-negotiable. If you know that your family is not safe, your children are not safe, you leave, and you have very little option. The question of where you move to, of course, that depends on so many different factors. And where are you safe? Where are you protected? There, of course, the security risks are important, and that's the security risks along the way. Which journey can you take? What do you know about these different countries? And of course, if you look at the map of Horn of Africa and where that's situated and which countries are there around, you know that the options are not that great, because many of the countries along the route are themselves in conflict. And also very often, well, do you actually have sufficient information? What kind of rumors are there? People are constantly after, like, where is the information that will tell me where I'm going to be safe? So security risks. Obviously survival chances. If you know that you have to walk through a desert for 2 weeks with your kids, well, that means that maybe you shouldn't. So where is it that you can actually know that your family is going to be safe, that you're going to be safe? It might also mean that you have to split up the family and decide, okay, well, the younger man might have a better chance in surviving. The children should go somewhere else and be, for example, staying in a refugee camp. So the family composition is very crucial. The individual risks, the survival chances is very central here as well. Obviously, also economic resources. It costs more the further you go. If you want to go all the way to Norway, that costs a lot of money. So that really determines where you're actually going to end up. And then something that Chris also pointed to, family members abroad. Do you have people who can help you get those resources, but also do you have a mother, a sister, a brother that you would like to live with? And also that can tell you, okay, here it's a good place to live. At the same time, of course, I mean, most refugees are hosted regionally. So that's true for Somalis, that's true for Ethiopians. And part of that is most wish to stay close. Especially in the beginning of a conflict, many people feel that, well, this is going to pass. A lot of the people I spoke to in Dadaab were like, well, I was thinking it was going to end. I didn't want to uproot my family. I don't want my children to become Americanized. I prefer for them to stay here, stay close, but then it continues and continues and continues. So this idea of temporariness also is an important factor in people choosing to stay close. But at the same time, there is also, even for those who want to move, there is a lack of resources and also a lack of access. You see that there's an increasing restriction in moving to particular other countries. At the same time, the regional protection has many challenges. First of all, these countries are in regional environments where violent conflict is quite widespread. And that is not just the case in the Horn of Africa. It's the same for Syrians, it's the same for many places in West Africa as well. And then very often there is a regional dynamics to the conflict. So for the Somali conflict, for example, the Kenyans, where Dadaab refugee camps host over 500,000 Somali refugees, at the same time the Kenyan government is actually military engaged in South Central Somalia and has an interest. At the same time, of course, there's security threats, various Al-Shabaab attacks in Kenya as well. So the regional dynamics is quite complex, and actually refugees are part of those dynamics. So very recently, the Kenyan government, for example, yet again said that within 3 months, Dadaab should be closed. And those 500,000 refugees should just go back. Now they've come back to it, but it's a constant a struggle where conflict dynamics are very regional and refugees are part of that. Other aspects of these protection challenges regionally is that there is a risk of detention and refoulement. So when you get protection regionally, many people, for example, in Libya actually ended up in detention in very bad conditions and also run the risks of being sent back without a fair looking at the application or looking at the refugee rights that they might have. And finally, also, particular individuals run particular risks. So you might see that in Dadaab, for example, the refugee camps, a number of high military officials were executed by the government from the country which they fled because of kind of the political position that they held. And that's much easier to do in the region. So some people don't actually get safety regionally. At the same time, we see an increasing call for regional solutions. And you see that both from civil society and also from governments. So one of the things that I've observed is that a range of also Norwegian NGOs are fundraising for regional programs, suggesting that this actually prevents people from crossing. So it becomes a fundraising strategy. Governments, there is the Khartoum process, which is the EU Horn of Africa migration route initiative that actually focuses on externalizing border control through agreements with countries like Kenya and Eritrea. And of course, Kenya is quite unwilling to host refugees. Eritrea is a country that produces refugees, if you could say, and also is quite, there is in Eritrea, the border guards have this shoot to kill order for everyone leaving Eritrea without permission. So going into agreements on migration control with a country like Eritrea gives them a stronger position also to control their migration even more. And sending people back to Eritrea and seeing that as a European solution, I think is quite problematic. So my conclusions. First of all, I thought what I wanted to show with these life histories is that refugees are ordinary people who are caught up in extraordinary circumstances. And I think one reason for the difficulty of seeing that is that they are circumstances that are man-made. It's much easier to relate to people who are faced with natural crisis, because then, okay, this is something beyond their fault, etc. But if you look at it as man-made circumstances, it becomes really, I guess, a way of surviving to distinguish yourself from those people, so that it's not something that can happen to anyone. It's very difficult to acknowledge that, I think. And secondly, I mean, I clearly wanted to show that one of the most effective strategies by which civilians who are caught up in war protect themselves and also their vulnerable family members is to move away from conflict zones. So the question is, where do they move to, and where can they move to? Needless to say that amongst the people who put their lives in danger in overcrowded boats are refugees who find no regional protection. So the protection of human rights and adherence to international refugee law needs to be a central element of any potential solution to the humanitarian crisis in the Mediterranean. And I thought, because it's not enough to just explain some of the drivers of migration without thinking of potential solutions or coming up with recommendations, I felt these two sources very useful: the FEPS policy brief and the PACO position on the need to create legal avenues. Firstly, saying that it's really important to develop effective solidarity mechanisms that enable an equitable distribution both worldwide and also within Europe. Secondly, obviously there needs to be more legal ways of entering the EU and more safe ways in order to seek asylum. And there are a couple of suggestions that were made there that I think are useful, and some of those are already explored. So issuing humanitarian visa in the regions, having an EU-wide resettlement scheme where countries are expected to take certain numbers according to their ability, exemptions from visa obligations and carrier liability. I think that's very important as well, so that people can do like Uber, for example, and come by plane, and then their cases can be processed. And then finally, it's obvious that we need to invest simultaneously in longer term solutions that tackle root causes. And I think that needs to be from the understanding that the responsibility for and the consequences of the humanitarian crisis are shared. And I feel that the strongest way in which this was illustrated was also this Aftenposten picture of the Eritrean boy that was taken up by this Greek fisherman with a Norwegian lure. And that was a Norwegian lure because his uncle had to come and get the corpse for his sister and nephew from Greece. And it really shows that, okay, well, Norwegian citizens are actually affected by what is happening in the Mediterranean, let alone, obviously, the Norwegian government as well. But there are responsibilities and consequences that we all share. Thank you very much.